A little bit more background about our Black founders, Wheatley Ockham, who was actually Native American, and John Merritt. This is the Free African Hall in Boston. It still stands, and at the time of Phyllis Wheatley and John Merritt's public work, this hall was a place where Wheatley might have read her poetry, although I don't have direct evidence of this, and it's a place where John Merritt delivered at least one of his sermons. The lodge was founded by Prince Hall, who is also the founder of the Black Masons and started a school for free blacks in Boston. He was a powerful community leader, and I would be surprised if he didn't know Phyllis Wheatley and her husband, John Peters, because the free black community at Beacon Hill in Boston was pretty tight and they had to stick together. But again, I don't know that we have documented evidence of their relationship or of their friendship. Nonetheless, Prince Hall definitely knew the preacher, John Merritt, because he invited him to deliver his sermon on brotherly love in Boston I believe, in 1780. Prince Hall did not have sponsorship, like I will mention in a moment. Wheatley, Merritt, and Ockham all had sponsorship from something called the Huntingdon Connection, and I'll tell you what that is next. Wheatley, Merritt, and Ockham received financial support from a group of evangelical whites, and again, this is just a picture of the outside of the African Meeting House, and I do not think that the Huntingdon Connection had anything to do with Prince Hall or the Black Lodge. I think it was a free black organization. But in contrast, these other black leaders received sponsorship and support and backing from a countess named Selina, Countess of Huntingdon. She was an English woman and she was very wealthy because her family owned sugar plantations in Jamaica. So she was probably one of the wealthiest people in England at that time. In addition to supporting Samson Ockham to a certain extent, Phyllis Wheatley for a little while, and John Merritt probably for an even shorter time, she sponsored and paid for the preaching evangelical revival tour of another white man called George Whitefield, who started a religious revival in the United States before the American Revolution, but in a way that continued after the American Revolution. So this is the wealthy English woman, and this is her friend, the minister George Whitefield, who was really central in starting a religious revival movement in what would become the United States, so that the United States went from being a pretty secular, not religious country at the time of the Revolution, and due to the spread of Whitefield's revivalism, called the Second Great Awakening, the United States became a very religious nation by 1800. And John Merritt became a preacher because he met George Whitefield. So the story that Merritt tells in his biography is that he was working as a musician. He was a teenager. He was having a good time living in Savannah. And they walked past the hall and heard George Whitefield preaching and people yelling and praising, etc. And his friend, John Merritt's friend, dared him to take his French horn. They were on their way to the gig and just go inside and blow the horn and scare everybody. But when Merritt went into the hall to hear the sermon, he became so enraptured that he was slain by the Spirit and he passed out. And as Whitefield said later, Jesus got him. So that was John Merritt's conversion. He became a follower to a certain extent of George Whitefield and thereby received funding from the Countess of Huntingdon. Now, it's interesting, I should mention, that he received money from the Countess of Huntingdon and support from George Whitefield, but at the same time, he spoke at the Free Hall in Boston and seems to have been friends with Prince Hall. It makes me wonder if he strategically worked the white crowd with the money to get support, to spread his message, and at the same time had an affinity and closeness for the Black leaders like Prince Hall. And another important point to consider about that is that Merritt later got a lot of support from the first British abolitionists, who were called the Clarksons, and wanted to help people who were freed from slavery during the American Revolution to move back to Africa. And that's kind of a long story, which I shan't go into right now. But it's interesting the role that Merritt played in between these wealthy whites who supported but kind of controlled Black leaders, and Black leaders like Prince Hall, who were more independent and kind of Black-centered. So finally, another part of this story, and the reason Samson Occom fits in with Merritt and Prince Hall and the Huntington connection, is that Samson Occom was under the tutelage and support of a man named Eleazar Wheelock, who was a close friend of the Countess of Huntingdon and funneled her money into projects in the United States. He received a huge sum of money from the Countess of Huntingdon that was supposed to be for the building of an Indian school, and the Countess had conferred with Phyllis Wheatley, had conferred with Samson Occom, who was a Mohegan Indian, and wanted to build this Indian school. And she did try to do things, surprisingly, to support Black and Native Americans, even though she was rich because of owning a ton of slaves and making a lot of money from sugar. Long story short, she gave the money to Wheelock, who was supposed to take care of it because she wouldn't give any money directly to Wheatley or Merritt or any of the Black leaders. And Wheelock took the money, and instead of allowing Occom to manage the school that he was supposed to build, he built Dartmouth University, which is still a very elite university in New Hampshire, mostly for wealthy white students, and they're trying to enroll Indian students to make reparation. But long story short, Samson Occom died in poverty, and Wheelock betrayed him. Speaking of betrayal, Phyllis Wheatley, at the death of her master, became a free woman and married a Black man named John Peters. About 50 years after Wheatley died, a white woman, Margaret Osgood Mason, wrote a biography of Wheatley and told this whole story about how Wheatley's husband was a scoundrel and a hack, and how he took advantage of her celebrity and of her financial position to exploit her, and that she died in sadness and poverty, and he abandoned her. That was the story the white woman told. Turns out, due to the research of an African-American writer called Honoré Fanon Jeffers, we now know, 200 years later, that there's no evidence that John Peters, Wheatley's husband, was any kind of a bad guy. Sure, he struggled in business as a free Black man, and he did have to go to debtor's court, as many people did. There was a Great Depression after the American Revolution, but there's really no evidence that he was a bad guy. Nonetheless, this Karen, Margaret Osgood Mason, wrote the story about him and blamed Phyllis Wheatley's death on basically this bad Black man who destroyed her. And that is absolutely not a true story. Now, although Wheatley did die in poverty, like Occom, and Merritt died in Canada, waiting to go back to Africa with some of his followers, Jeffers has imaginatively come up with this beautiful story about Wheatley and her husband to replace the pack of lies created by the white woman who wrote the first biography of Wheatley. And you can go to these two YouTube videos to hear the recreation of the love letters between Phyllis Wheatley and John Peters. And you can, I won't take this time in the video to do that. You can do that if you browse through the PowerPoint again. And you can then watch the YouTube videos, because I think they're really lovely. Now, back to John Merritt, who I just told you a little bit about. He was born a free man in New York, a free Black man in New York, moved to Charleston with his family, and had, I believe, when he was working in Savannah as a musician, that conversion experience with George Whitefield, or supposedly did, because, maybe he wanted to be a preacher. Merritt wrote his narrative, the story of his life, but one of the other documents that we have surviving from Merritt is this speech that he gave at the Free African Hall. And I'm just scrolling up here to the beginning of the document. It's a sermon on brotherly love. And he condemns people who do not practice brotherly love because, of course, that is the golden rule. He mentions that his brothers, the Masons, know that they're called to God to practice brotherly love. And he beseeches his brethren to present your bodies as a holy sacrifice to God. The ancient masonry will endeavor to prove to all of their titles that we have a just right as Masons to claim to be honorable, free, and accepted. So he starts to make a somewhat political argument here about the equality of the Black Masonic Lodge and the Black people to whom he's preaching. So if God, in this part of the speech, if all things were in the order prepared for the most excellent accomplishment of God's creation, man, then we would all practice brotherly love. And a little bit later in the sermon, God gave us the reasonableness of angels, gave us the power of brutes, and the virtue of all the elements. Man is crowned with glory and honor in the most remarkable workmanship of God, a noble creature and made to converse with his fellow men of his own order, to maintain mutual love and society, and to serve God in comfort with each other. Okay, this is a beautiful picture he's painted of the world. Then he says, then what can these God-provoking wretches think, who despise their fellow men as though they were not of the same species with themselves, and would, if in their power, deprive them of the blessings and comforts of this life, which God in his bountiful goodness has freely given to all his creatures to improve and enjoy? Surely such monsters never came out of the hand of God in such a forlorn condition. Which brings me to consider the fall of man. So here, I think it's pretty clear that he's talking about racists, about people who support slavery. And I think it's astounding and amazing that he talks about inequality, talks about slaveholders as monsters, and then says that this is the condition of man because of the fall. So the fall of man is the creation of race and racism. A truly amazing religious idea and criticism of people who claim to be religious that comes shortly after his depiction of how beautiful the world would be if we truly lived in brotherly love. So that is John Merritt, and that's why I thought you should know about him. I think it's fascinating to consider what would happen if we put John Merritt and Phyllis Wheatley and maybe the Countess of Huntingdon and Thomas Jefferson, both of whom were slaveholders, and Samson Occam and Prince Hall, all in the same room at a dinner party, and had them sort out their differences. Honore Jeffers writes the love letters between Wheatley and her husband imaginatively. I really want to imagine the story of what would happen if we put all of these people in the same room. So that's just something to think about. Have a great day.